Welcome back to this lovely room.
We go till 10:30, right?
Right, yes. I'm really thrilled to introduce the Reverend Dr. Lucy Lind Hogan, who is the Harry Latimer Elderdice.
Hugh Latimer Elderdice.
Professor of Preaching and Worship at Wesley Theological Seminary, which is right across, yay, some of you have right across the river.
Right across the river.
And Lucy is an Episcopal priest, and in fact, a graduate of VTS in the class of 1981. But she was just telling me something I didn't know, which is she started at CDSP in 1976, which was the year that the church voted to ordain women as priests. So she is in the
And I can remember sitting there, they came into class to tell us, and I was from Minneapolis, so it was right by my home parish in Minneapolis, and I can remember sitting there thinking, phew, that's done. I don't have to fight that.
Yeah, I'm sure she's never had to deal with any discrimination or prejudice in your whole entire ministry.
No.
So, no, it's all done now. So anyway, then Lucy went on to get a Doctor of Ministry at Wesley Theological Seminary, and then her doctorate in communications at the University of Maryland. And she is a very illustrious member of the Academy of Homiletics. She's been the president of the Academy twice, and the president of Societas Homiletica, which is the International Association of Homileticians. And she's written many books, of which the most recent are Graceful Speech, which is her textbook on preaching, and The Six Deadly Sins of Preachers, or Preaching. Preaching. Okay, right, okay, preaching. Yeah, we won't get into the
I don't want to talk about the deadly sins of preachers.
Yeah, that's right. No.
That would take too long.
Okay, right. Well, you said 10:30, so anyway. Okay, so we will talk about preaching. And that was with Bob Reed, your colleague, and now you're working with him on another book about rhetoric for homileticians, which is one of her main
No, that one is just me.
Oh, that's just you. Okay.
That one is just me.
All right, see, so I'm getting some of this information, but not all of it. So anyway, it is my honor and joy to welcome my friend and colleague, Lucy Lind Hogan.
Well, it is a joy to be here. Oh, I am mic'd. I'm a mover. So I am so glad when Mark invited me to come and explore preaching and media with you. And I will tell you shortly, I had no idea what he wanted. So we're going to explore a lot of things this evening, but I'm not going to do all the talking because I'm talking to people who are wrestling with a lot of these things already. But I always begin my talks with clergy as a cheerleader. I am a cheerleader to thank you for what you do, that what you're doing is taking this seriously and continuing to work on your preaching. Let's see if I can get this to move. 83%. So why do I say that? 83%. When the Pew Forum did a study a few years ago and asked people, when you are searching for a new congregation, what are you looking for? Does anybody know about this study? And what was 83%? The quality of preaching, number one. Okay. I have another number, then what is this? This is the Gallup poll that said, for people who attend church, what is the most important? 75% said, I go to church to hear sermons about the Bible. So what you are doing, the polls would say, is the most important thing in growing the church, growing disciples, bringing people to Christ. So I'm here to say thank you. As one who sits in the pew, but I can tell you, people do not like to look out and see a preaching professor. It is, and Ruth Anna, I'm sure you know that too, right? Preaching and media. So it was fascinating when I sat down to think, what are we going to talk about? There's so many, we only have till 10:30, so, but I thought, okay, media, well, medium, the singular, the Latin word, middle. It means agency. It is a means of doing something. Media, the main means of mass communication. So when we talk about preaching and media, what do we mean? Are we talking about media? Are we thinking about legacy media? What are legacy media? Newspaper, television, microfiche. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Films, radio, photographs. Well, that is real legacy media. Are we talking about social media? Are we talking about Facebook, Instagram, Twitter? Are we talking about visual media in your sermons, film clips, images? So the question is, what does medium and media have to do with preaching? I'd like to suggest that those words, medium, singular, and media, plural, introduce us to the idea of being a means by which something is communicated. It is a go-between. It is a go-between. It stands between one thing and another. Who are the artists in here? I know you've been talking about preaching and art, but who are the artists in here? Okay, what do you mean when you talk about a medium? What you use. So if you ask an artist, you might say, well, what's your medium? Say, well, I work in watercolor, or I primarily work in oils, or I work in pencil. What about a writer? Writers have mediums, right? So some people are poets, some people write fiction, some people write mystery novels, some people write plays. Each of those is their medium. But again, it's this sense of the go-between, the go-between. So a middle quality. And so when we think about media, now mass communication, we think about all the ways that those are the go-between, the intermediary. So this evening, I would like to explore a number of the aspects of this. And as I said, I thought this could be a whole semester. I realized, and I emailed Mark and I said, well, what did you have in mind? And I gave him about 7, I could talk about this, or I could talk about that, or I said, do you want me to talk about how preachers intersect and respond to mass media, the news, fake media, and alternate news? And, and I had no idea. We're right in the middle of it again. Words matter. Words matter. And it took some man over the top yesterday morning to not just a few blocks from here to shoot a congressman that he didn't agree with. I said, do you want me to talk about how preachers talk about the political issues in their preaching? So I'm going to touch on a few of these things, and we will talk about using images in our preaching. So we're going to sort of move toward that. But I've arranged this as a series of questions. And I'm going to raise the questions, and I'm not going to answer them totally, because I want to leave some time for us to talk. Because I'm not talking to a whole group of students who are just learning how to preach. And some of you have wisdom on these issues that I hope we're going to leave some time for you to share, or to share how you have wrestled with some of these things. But I'm going to begin with my first question, which is, are we the medium, the media? As a preacher, are we the medium? And we, as a group of preachers, would be the media. Are we God's medium? Are we the medium that God is working with? Are we the means by which something is communicated? The Word becomes flesh through our flesh. Through our experiences, our knowledge, our questions, our anger, our uncertainties, our laughter. The Word becomes flesh through our flesh. And so what are the substances, the materials that we use? What are our mediums? Words. Sometimes we don't even say a word. I know Ruth Anna's been talking to you about, what 80% of our communication is nonverbal. I don't like to tell my students that, since I am trying to get them to actually write words. But as preachers, as the medium, we are always faced with what I call the Monday moment. Now, a lot of you are thinking, Monday, that means I have to start writing another sermon. Well, that is a Monday moment, but the Monday that I'm thinking about is the second day of the week, because on the evening of the first day of the week, Jesus appeared to the disciples behind a locked door and said to them, "Peace be with you. Don't be afraid." And so on Monday, because Thomas wasn't there, on Monday, that morning, they went on, they said, "Thomas, you are not going to believe it. We really did see him." Well, unless I see him, unless I put my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe. And we always focus on Thomas. I bet you all have a whole drawers full of doubting Thomas. And I always tell my students, I said, get ready, because as soon as you're ordained, you're not going to preach Easter, but you sure are going to preach doubting Thomas. So you might as well start writing that sermon right now. We always focus on that. Do we ever think about how Peter or the disciples or Mary, when they said this is just an idle tale, do we ever think about what they felt like? What do you mean you won't believe me? We've just been walking together for 3 years, watching all of that, sitting and talking, and now you're not going to believe me? Wait a minute. So it's not easy being a medium. It's not easy being media for God's message, because we, like Peter, we like Mary, we often feel dissed. We feel ignored. We feel that our congregations look at us like this is an idle tale. Why should I believe this? And so I think we need to pay attention to Mary and to Peter and the disciples and think about that even with that, they kept going. So that's one question. What does it mean to be God's medium? Now, I do not think that this is an easy time to be a preacher. And probably you can talk to the church historians or the historians of preaching, and they would say, it's never been easy. But I don't know about you, but I sit and I turn on the television every evening and I hear about the words that have been said and what is happening, and the fact that we can laugh, which we aren't really laughing, at alternative facts or fake news, or I'm only going to believe what I want to believe and what is true. Thomas was skeptical, and we live in an age of skepticism. So what does it mean to preach in this social media world? It means to preach to a world of Thomases. Unless I see, unless I experience, unless I put my hands in his side, I'm not going to believe. We actually have, I believe, a postmodern president. And we have to pay attention to that. Because his attitude is, I have the power, therefore I have the truth. And whatever I say is the truth. Michel Foucault, the philosopher, would say, absolutely, Donald, you are absolutely right. You have the power, therefore you have the truth. And that makes a big difference on how we approach our preaching. How do we frame an argument? How do we convince? And I'm going to make a little sidebar here because I think this is something that we don't always talk about enough. You know, preaching is contextual. Just to use the rhetoric words, it is written for a particular group of people in a particular place at a particular time. So I have to convince my students there is no such thing as an evergreen sermon because it will never land. It will never touch that congregation. And that's a good reason that people should never preach someone else's sermon, because that sermon was written for that person. So even if Adam Hamilton or somebody tells you that they're a much better preacher and you should preach their sermons, don't believe them. People want to hear from you. You are God's medium for that congregation. But one of the things that we're not paying attention enough, I think, and you probably get glimpses of it every once in a while, but we're not doing enough, it is, thinking about how our world and our relationships and our communication is being changed by social media. You know, Plato did not like the fact that there was writing. He said, we shouldn't write. He said that creates distance between the author and the reader. Well, there's writing. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, all those monks who were now out of a job, after having written the Bible, said, this isn't going to work, you know. This isn't going to be good. You're going to regret it. And we still have our printed Bibles, and don't you really like to have a real book sometime? My husband said, you know what I really, and maybe there's a big group here. You know when you buy a real hardcover book, and some of the books have, is there anybody who is a librarian? Where some books have really crinkly edge, you know, they haven't trimmed off or anything. My husband said, I just love that. I'm only going to buy books that have that now. But writing did change things, and the printing press did change things. And we are not paying enough attention to how social media is reshaping everything. Reshaping everything. Studies show that increased use of social media can lead to loneliness and depression. And I have had my younger students tell me they feel very uncomfortable with face-to-face conversations. So one of the classes I teach now at the seminary is a pure, when I was doing my PhD at Maryland, I would teach Speech 107. It was required, certainly for all the business majors. Listening, interviewing, small group, how to manage a small group. And I have started teaching basic communication at Wesley. And do you know, when at the end of the semester, they tell me the section that they loved the most was the section on listening. Because they realize they don't know how to listen to one another or to people. Now, I'll also tell you, part of the assignment was to identify a person in your life who is you would consider a really good listener, and talk to that person and figure out what made them such a good listener. And you'll be happy to know that grandmothers are the number one. As a grandmother myself, I said, yes. So we need to, when we think about preaching and media, we need to think about the impact that social media is having on our preaching. Even if you're not doing a podcast, and we could talk about that too. Podcasts, blogs, I mean, there's so many different ways we can be proclaiming the gospel. I mean, think about Paul. He said, I don't need to stand in a pulpit. He said, I can go down by a riverbank and proclaim good news to people. So we have to be thinking of all the various ways. Just stepping out of the pulpit is not enough. So there's so many different ways. But the context in which we are preaching is being shaped by Twitter, 140 characters. The thought that you can just get that out there. And the immediacy of it. The immediacy of it. That's what the president keeps saying. He doesn't want you to listen to Sean Spicer. He doesn't want you to listen to all those other people. Just listen to me. I'm going to put it on Facebook. I'm going to put it on Twitter. I'm going to get it out there myself. And then you're hearing right from me. But these are our media, that don't allow for nuance, that don't allow for a developed argument. And so we have to think about that. What does that mean? I think another thing that we have to think about is that we live in an age of stress. And we are preaching to people who are stressed. The American Psychological Association found that in February, 57 people in this political climate were stressed. And you know, they were talking about these, it was very sad that these people were shot. And as one person said, people are shot in Washington every day. They're just not congressmen. So people are shot every day. So it's a world that is divided. It is a world, and one of the challenge is that people are receiving information from so many different sources. You know, all you have to do is go back 150 years ago, that people read the Bible, they'd come to church, they would have a newspaper, but it wasn't that, you know, the moment I wake up in the morning, I can turn on my phone and see if something has happened. Instantly I know. Unfortunately, people are not very critical about where they get their sources. And that's one of the things that we're finding, is that all you have to do is drop things that are not true at all. They know they're not true, but people will believe them. Because if it's on the media, if it's on social media, if it's on, you know, on Facebook, people will believe it. So this is the where we are preaching. The other thing that's happening is, I know you all probably think, when I was in graduate school, one of my classmates, all we did was talk about post-modernity, and she started making a collection of postmodern candlesticks and postmodern whatever. But the ideas of postmodernity do make a difference for us, because what it means is that, just what I've been saying, people won't necessarily believe us because there is no more accepted meta-narrative. You cannot assume to stand up and say, let's talk about creation. Say, well, which creation story? So my colleagues Wes Allen and Ron Allen had recently wrote a book called The Sermon Without End, A Conversation Approach to Preaching, and they ask, how shall the church and its preachers respond to the changing cultural context of postmodernity? Now, again, that would be a whole semester, but since we're only here till 10:30. But it means that we have to pay attention to that. And so Ron and Wes suggest that we have to have a much more conversational approach to preaching, meaning engaging in discussion and asking what people are thinking about. So I would recommend that book. But I would like to suggest a few things. And even though part of postmodernity is that there is not a sense of an overarching meta-narrative anymore, I think that one of the things that we have to do as preachers is we have to be grounded in our community. So we have to know who we are. And Karl Barth, I don't always agree with Karl Barth, but on some things he was, and on this he was correct. We need to read the Bible in one hand and our iPhone in the other. So we have to know the world in which we're living, and we have to know our Bible. So it means that to preach in the social media world, we need to read a lot. We have to ask a lot of questions. We have to get to know the strangers in our midst. We have to go outside of the door of our church and know who our neighbors are. We have to talk to them. We have to respect them. We have to honor them. It means, also for us, it means we can never assume, and I'm guessing that I could get an amen on this, we can never assume that people in our congregation know what we're talking about. Amen. They don't always know the stories. That gets a suggestion from me every time I say, well, we all know the story of. No, they don't. No, they don't. They don't know that. And so we can never assume that people know what we're talking about. So we have to be grounded firmly in the scriptures. We have to be grounded firmly in the stories of the church, of the great cloud of witnesses, and we have to be very grounded in the questions and the conversations of our theology, of our foundation, because then we can talk to people, then we can listen to what their concerns are, and it means listening to the cultural conversation that is swirling about us and thinking about what it means. So let me stop for a moment. And so, because now I want to move into talking about, the next question is, what is the intersection of preaching and images? So I want to talk about that. But so I want to stop and see if anybody has a comment, a question, an experience. Oh, I think we have to, yes, talk into the microphone. And oh, yes.
So I've been reflecting on how in Jesus' time, or in the ancient Near East, there was a lot of fake news. So you had the fact that you have the four Gospels written by four people who probably weren't really the people who wrote them, and there's these different...
Well, someone wrote it.
Right, someone wrote it, right? But they gave it someone else's name, and history in general, sort of took lots of liberties with the truth for centuries until the last few hundred years, and then we started to really kind of get concerned about accuracy and scientific things like that. And so sometimes I feel like we're kind of going back in time to this time where it's not as important. Fudge the facts a little bit. That's they've been doing it for millennia, right? But it feels so disturbing to us and jarring because we've now come to insist on factual accuracy and scientific precision and all of that.
And authorship.
And
copyrights and
so I guess my question, that's a reflection, and I guess I'm reflecting and asking the question. So what's the big deal, right? In the bigger sense of the history of who we are as a species on the planet.
Well, I wish that Ron, particularly Ron, wish that Ron was here, and because here's what Ron would say. Ron would say, "You're absolutely right," because what we can give to our congregation, Ron would say, is, I have read the scriptures and I have thought about this, and I think I'd like to suggest that this is a way we can think about this. Now, Ron is responding to the image of the preacher that this is the way it is and you better believe it, this is the way it is. And he said, this is not the way people think about things anymore. And so he would say, well, you are the medium, you are the go-between, and you're reading scripture, you're listening to the movement of the Spirit in your life and in your prayers, and you come not as the one who absolutely has all the truth, but let me suggest to you that this is what's come out of my study in the scripture and where we are, what's happening right now, and let's talk about it. How are you experiencing God? How are you experiencing the questions of life? So, yes, and this is I want to make sure that somebody else if someone else has a question, but what I would say is in some ways we are going back because there are some really good things about in the pre-modern way of approaching things that we're starting to say, well, I think that's a good way too. I mean, I bet a lot of you have gone to conferences on storytelling, right? What was the earliest preaching? Storytelling. And what story were they telling? Their story. They all sat at the table and said, here's what God is doing in my life. And some of the earliest ones were really fortunate. I did hear Jesus. And this is what he said. And the farther we got away from that, the story, but you have those stories in your life, right? You have those stories where Jesus brought you up short and said, you're not going to keep doing that, are you? And say, well, I was thinking about it. So, anyone else? Oh, wait. Oh, one and then one. Oh, whoa.
I am wondering about another complexity that I feel that we're caught in, and wonder what you think. Because there are the people in our pews who, they have no idea what we're talking about, and they have their own thoughts. But I also feel that there's a big part of our society that wants the black and white and wants you to point and say, yeah, this is how it is. And there's so many who are flocking to those kind of preachers, those kind of churches. And so how do we manage?
I think you identify a really important tension for us, because I know there's been a series for, Living the Questions. Well, that's going to appeal to some people, but some people are going to say, aren't there any answers? So I do think that people, we have to learn how to proclaim the good news without saying, and I, this is the good news, I think. I have to say, I worked with a priest for a number of years, and he was a very, very dear man, and he was very, very important in my life. And he was really into social justice, and he would give these really, good social justice sermons, and then he'd say, we have to do this, but I'm not sure we can. That was how it always ended. It was like he would just deflate you. It was like, oh, okay. So I don't have an answer, but I think that's another thing we have to pay attention to, because people are looking for help in how do they navigate this? How do they navigate this world? What do I believe? What am I supposed to believe?
And as a follow-up to that, I'm a person of certain convictions, and I think as a preacher, I'm willing to make a fool of myself because I do that almost daily. Even just, I was just talking about the resurrection, for instance, and the coming back of Jesus, and some who were part of that conversation will say, "Oh yeah, she was talking about that." And I am very genuinely excited about that thought. And I can proclaim that just talking to a friend or anybody who's willing to listen, that to me it is absolutely true, and I will try to convince you. But people do look at me askance, like, she's a little weird. So I think as a preacher, sometimes we have, at least I feel like I have to be willing to say with a certain conviction that this is what I believe the Bible is saying, and leave it there, whether people want to believe it or not. But I think that has to come through, and I don't know if...
But it means we have to know the scriptures.
Oh, yeah.
And we have to know that there are points, of course, that, you all remember when you were first sitting in your Bible class, or, your first Old Testament class and New Testament, and then they'd say, well, but it says this here, and then it says this over here, and this, say, what? Wait a minute. That contradicts that, so yeah, it's there. One more question, and then we'll move on. Oh, yeah.
I've always found that the preachers who call my attention the most are the ones who are able to actively describe a picture and kind of place me into a particular place, or even make very abstract ideas very concrete. I find sermons that talk about the Holy Spirit or fairly vague, equations and tautologies to be exhausting. But a sermon about money where the preacher says, imagine I'm holding $100 bill and I'm going to burn it. Immediately.
Be a lot better if he really burned it.
No, yeah, it'd be really amazing if he did, right? And that captivates my attention.
Okay,
so.
let if you would allow me to interrupt you, let's do an exercise. Okay. If you are willing and comfortable closing your eyes, would you close your eyes? All right. I'm going to say a series of words, and I'll give a moment of silence. I would like you to think about this. Something is going to come to mind. So if you could write it down, just what like a psychiatrist would say, what first comes into your mind? Grace. Sin. Hope. faith. All right. What came to mind? Let's take them in that order. When grace. So when I said the word grace, what came to mind? What did you say? Limitless. A word. A word. Another abstract concept. A what? A bet. A bed. A bed. Concrete. A chalice. Okay. Dinner. Dinner. You saw a table. Okay. Far away. A word. Abstract concept. Jesus. Tree. Free. Abstract concept. Okay. How about sin? Darkness. Fire. Shame. Abstract concept. Burdensome. Yeah. A cup. Cut. A cut. Broken. Secrets. All right. Abstract concept. Sort of. Chain. All right. How about hope? How about hope? Obama. Abstract concept. A vista. All right. What? Christ. Joy. All right. And faith. Trust. Abstract concept. Bridge. All right. Conviction. Abstract concept. Tightrope. All right. An image. Abstract. Okay. So do you see what for some of you, that abstract concept of a word was you got more words. And the reason I did that was because for you, you're saying, you know, when that preacher talks about something, it becomes it's something you can see. And I think that that's a challenge for a lot of preachers, is they're so caught up in words. Now, I'll tell you why. Because we are, and now I'm going to go forward to, let's say, the intersection between preaching and images, because we came out of a literate culture. So we're so connected with words. And so in his book, Envisioning the Words, Richard Jensen looks at sort of the progression. So first it was an oral culture. And, but, you know, that's why Homer knew, they memorized everything. They weren't a word. But right away, we were illiterate. Our faith is grounded in a book and letters and the Gospels. So that we were right from the beginning illiterate, even though we had the storytellers. But those words were still important. Now, fortunately, we had a Jesus who showed us. So, who are journalists in here? Any journal people who were journalists? And what did you hear over and over again? Show us, don't tell us. Show us. And so I think that for a lot of preachers, one of the challenges is how to make that transition from being a wordy grounded in abstract concepts into thinking of images. Now, one of the ways is that a lot of people have done it is in storytelling. Now, probably when I first started teaching in the 80s, storytelling sermons, narrative sermons, storytelling sermons were really big. And for a true narrative storytelling sermon, you didn't even ever resolve it. You basically just told a story, and then your listeners were to figure out for themselves what it was. Well, that didn't last very long, because people's like, well, okay, what's the point? What's the resolution? And so people didn't really like that. But a story, I would argue, is a little different than an image. All right, so, and so I think that one of the challenges for preachers today is to think in images. So to go home and think, okay, when I think about hope and faith, think more of an image. And I'll just give you something that you could try. So my colleagues, well, they both are retired. Tom Troger has retired from Yale, and my Nora is almost retired. But there's the sermon workbook, and they have an exercise for their students, and they say, take one of these abstract concepts, like grace, and then think about grace looks like what? Or grace tastes like. Grace smells like. Grace feels like, and by that they mean not soft like a kitten, but bodily weight. Or grace sounds like. And I often will do this exercise with my students, and I can tell you that grace is just like grandmothers are the best listeners, grace is hot chocolate chip cookies. But Jesus knew that we needed to do this. And he could have said, you know, God just loves us, and God loves you, and God is going to forgive you. Yeah. But so he gives us an image. And that image, it takes a while to get to the image, but the image is of that father picking up his robes and running out to that son in that image. You know, and I have a suspicion that Jesus told all those stories and the parables. He knew all those people. He knew that man who had 2 sons. He didn't make that up. He knew that person. Just like he knew that woman who put that coin in the treasury. He knew her. And he knew all of those people and said, you know, that'd be a really good way to show them. So I think that we're moving into out of a literate culture into we are in an image culture. Now there's some arguments because people say, well, we've always been an image culture, and we have. But you just look at your Facebook feed the next time, not now. But I can definitely tell that you're not my 25-year-olds, because you're looking at me. And you're not shopping for shoes, I'm guessing. They're so dumb. I'm a mover, you can tell. And I'll be over here, and they'll be right there and say, is that what you're going to make for dinner? Really? But your Facebook feed will show you how many, it's images. It's because it's right. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And so we have to learn how to think in pictures. Now, one of the ways to think of pictures is actually to have pictures. Now, how many of you have some way of showing images in your worship service? Okay. Well, but you see, I mean, we always have images, yes, and but so really very few of you are actually projecting images. I think it's going to get easier because what you're not going to have to do, and I'm just going to say, I think you got to think about it because people. I had a student, young Korean woman, come and to talk to me, and I thought, okay, she's nervous because she's going to be preaching in English, but her English was very good, but she was young, and she came and she said, she said, don't you think that preaching is done? I said, well, tell me more. And she said, well, with my youth group, when we're doing, and these big, huge Korean churches, they have, the youth are having their own worship. And she said, I can preach, but if I show them a film clip, then they're really engaged. And I said, you've given me something to think about. Because I don't think that preaching is done. But I do think that, again, we have to pay attention. We preach to people who are bombarded by images constantly. And if we don't figure out some ways of incorporating images in our preaching. Now, for a long time, the way it's been is the bulletin cover, which usually is a stream or a tree, or it might be a Bible picture. But so I think that one of the things that preachers do have to become much better at is that we have grown up in a literate culture, so we are used to thinking in linear development ideas, propositions, making propositions, being very analytical, and thinking in ideas, so that when we have a metaphor, when we tell a story, it is to illustrate, not to be the thing. And so Richard Jensen says, we need to begin to think in pictures. We have to think in pictures. We have to show, not tell. Now, here's the debate I want to have for a minute. As I said, I think that more and more churches are going to have some way of projecting images. So some of the questions, and we could again have a whole semester on, well, how do you do that in a sermon? First of all, if you do it, don't overwhelm them. Pick only a few. You don't want, it's not like you're showing them your travel slides. And then we went, do you remember carousels? Slide carousels? I had to, in my class, we were talking about how many, and I pulled up, I went to Google and I, clicked on so they could show that what a slide carousel looked like. They were like, wow. But I know, and I was the daughter of Bill Lind who did this, and you'd go to people's houses and they wanted to show you every. Now, I also have people who will post on Facebook that on a trip, and I'll look and it'll say 44 more images, and I think, do they really think that I'm going to look at all of those images? So, but I want to have a little bit of debate. I want to have some of you say, no, we should not, if we're going to have images, it's that I'm going to build those images through my words. And then I want to have some people who say, well, no, we really have to show images. And I just want to say it's going to get easier because remember you had to have a big screen and that projector like this. You're not going to have to do that anymore. You can do what the cathedral does. Just have several monitors So they're right there. They're really unobtrusive, and they can all be linked. So you can just have your computer, and they'll come up on the screen. So it's actually going to be much cheaper to do that. But let's have a little bit of a debate here. How are we going to show those images? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Just to be the devil's advocate, I'm on the side of not having images.
Not having images.
No, I think it's probably good. Are we getting more?
Oh, yeah. So you would like to argue not to have actual physical images?
I just want to bring up the point that people keep sending me on Facebook again and again this article about what millennials want in church. And this article says again and again they do not want the world. They want the old-fashioned way without images. And you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Have you seen this article?
Now, wait a minute. Let's be fair. Are there any millennials in here? Well, you're the representative.
I was 27, and I became the rector of Holy Comforter Episcopal Church in Spring that had screens, and I ripped them out.
All right.
Get them out of here!
So why do you think that we shouldn't have? You have the microphone.
No, I think we probably should.
So pass it back.
So I had an experience where I was working for a organization that was trying to fundraise, and so they basically said, you got to post for our donors. Essentially, if you don't post it, it didn't happen. And I remember dying there, right? Because pastoral moments are not for anybody except the person. And so anyway, I just remember thinking, like, wouldn't it be amazing if we didn't have, so that any folk, because I have my phone and I'm not a millennial, could have something that they experience that they don't have in their cloud. So that would be why I would go to Jimmy's church.
Is that the only reason?
No, he's awesome.
All right.
Yeah. So as I said, but I also do think you're right. A large reason why I decided to rip the screens out was because they were obtrusive and not they didn't fit the worship space. While they were there, I did use them to project images, but since it wasn't working in the space, but I do think you're right with sleeker projection systems and whatnot. I do think it's actually a good tool. But I do think it also calls for a balance of
Right.
not using images all the time.
Right.
I was derided and mocked by all my peers of being the youngest one and ripping the screens out. So it was it was a moment of glory for me.
It's interesting that many churches in my neck of the woods or the South chose white walls, and the churches that a lot of them that I'm in the North have a complete iconographic system, and it's related to the medieval times, and they create a huge. Every canticle at St. Bart's, or at least 7 of them, are portrayed in beautiful Art Deco sequential images of glory. And those static images prove very powerful, and they relate. There's something about the moving image in churches that I think is wrong, because it co-opts the space. Moving images that quickly is like crack rock in terms of what it does to your brain. But the static image and the word, I think, do something differently.
So there were.
So I had an experience of an image during the prayers of the people. It was after the Virginia Tech massacre. And as we were praying, a different image would come up for different parts of the prayers of the people. And when it got to the part about suffering, the image that came up were kids in Virginia Tech sweatshirts hugging each other.
But actual
Yeah,
images.
Actual images.
Okay. I mean, it isn't just in your mind.
No. And this is what was projected. And so before I could access my own inner life to pull up a prayer, to imagine, to remember anything, before God. I was told what to remember.
Exactly.
And so it was really an inappropriate use of images. But in preaching, when you really are provoking, and an image can actually help you, a film clip or a picture could potentially help you make an illustration or get a point or help somebody access something, it seems like a totally different spot for it. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm desperate for a way to project images. I ask weekly for some way to be able to do this, and I have had so many instances where my sermon would have been improved tenfold by an image. I mean, I preached once about. Did you all see the video of Joshua Bell playing his violin in the metro?
In the subway?
Would have been perfect. I mean, I preached about the Cassini orbiter to Saturn. It would have been perfect. There's so many instances where, I mean, appropriate, not all the time, short clips, used well, would make all the difference in the world. All they have is my description of it. They may or may not understand what I'm describing, but if you can show them, it changes everything. Huge fan.
I'm not opposed to images and stuff, and sometimes I really want to use them. And for for sermons to small groups, I do sometimes actually print up images and do some show and tell and pass them out later. But I do think about like the power of like podcasts and radio and like This American Life and things like that. People don't need images necessarily if you're telling telling a story in images. And so I mean I'd love to be a storyteller like the people that have the great podcasts. So.
Yeah. I saw, you have one, and then there's somebody way in the back. You know why people sit in the back row at church?
Why?
Because there are no pews in the parking lot. I love having a new audience.
Also, there's no air conditioning in the back.
I
don't. Oh, it is on. Very nice. So we're talking about two-dimensional images, and I just want to raise up the beauty of three-dimensional images and how they can be used powerfully. One, probably, image per sermon, and hold up that that empty vessel or, whatever. But those are, I still remember, way back when I was a layperson in the pews and the rector held up this sword talking about actually the gospel for next week where Jesus says, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. And those kind of things are powerful and don't require, to me, there's a distance, and I'm not opposed to using technology and screen images, but I personally think it creates some distance. People are looking at the screen. They're not looking at you or your facial expressions. And it's not all about us, but we need that personal connection, I think.
Do you hear how many issues and things to think about are coming up? And there's both sides, but we have to learn how to think of those.
Yeah, we have screens in our church, and the church was built to have screens as well, and so it really lends itself to a good experience. And we use it, but we don't use it with every sermon. I'd say probably 20% of the sermons would have something in it, but it's good to have. What I noticed, though, we have something called Sermon Seconds where we make a summary every week of the sermon. And once the fellow who creates the Sermon Seconds for us started using images with the Sermon Second, they would send out artwork as part of the Sermon Seconds. We had this huge response in regard to it. And so what you're saying really resonates.
So this goes out online?
Yeah, it's an email. It's an email.
And
yeah.
So think more about it?
Yeah, and people forward it to their friends and everything else. But the images, once he started taking some time to really have images that matched the biblical text for the day, it really took off for some reason. And I think the images were a part of it because it was the same preachers.
Great. Pass it back. Two more.
I love images, but the issue I have and the issue I keep running into is how to properly note and get permission from the artist. I feel very strongly about making sure that musicians and artists receive the right kind of recompense for what they've created because it's beautiful, and they usually don't because of the way images are done on the internet now. We can take anyone's artwork and use it and not even
And
have
that
to
is
ask for permission.
Particularly true with showing a film clip. Now, I get to do them at school because they are always available for academic, but you have to be very careful if you're going to show a film clip in
Someone's art on my bulletin cover, I always email the artist
what it
and ask
is.
permission.
Yeah. One more, and then I want to raise another issue.
I was gonna. There are two reasons I use them sometimes. Sometimes that image will cement what I'm saying, and two, because I recognize that there are different learning styles. So some people will hear, and some people will see the message and go, "Oh, that's it." So sometimes, that image could save 5 minutes in a sermon.
So I hope that we come out of, as we think about the intersection of preaching and images, we realize how complicated and how complex it is and how important, but either side has its pros and its cons, and it's about learning how to use them carefully and thoughtfully. And I would argue that it's the same of the images that you describe in your sermon. You can describe something and you can it will hijack your sermon. And people will, you've created such an image in their mind. Now, one of the pros of not using actual images is when you are creating images with words, your listeners are your partner. Because they're working to create those images in their mind. The moment you give them the image, it becomes passive. They don't have to do the work, it's there. They can look at it. And one of the examples that I always use is for children who started reading Harry Potter, there were little drawings in it, but as they pictured Harry and Hermione and what's the boy? Ron, and what Hogwarts looked like, they built it in their mind. And it was however you did it, it was how it was. But the moment the movie came out, that stopped it. Because then Hogwarts was the way they showed you. And that was Harry, and that was Hermione. So I think we have to learn how to use images because we are an image culture. It's how people are thinking now. It is how people are communicating now. But we have to learn how to use them carefully, thoughtfully, and not just slap something up. And I find it very interesting that I see, a lot of churches have, they'll show a film clip, but they will show, if they have a screen, the images often that they will show are nature. I laughed because it's a stream, but iconoclasm is still alive. And in those congregations, they will show you pictures of art, but they won't show you art. They'll show you nature, but they won't show you art because there's still, the iconoclasm is still alive and well. So I think the reason I raise this question is because I think that this is going to be a way that preachers have to begin to continue to grow in thinking about images, whether they're going to be in their sermon through their words or to actually be projected. Because I agree with you. You can show someone like the things from the outer space, the Hubble telescope, or and people, it can be wonderful. But you have to know, why are you doing this? It's not entertainment. It is expanding our vision. So I lied to you. We're not really going till 10:30. we're actually, I believe, going till 8:30, and I'd like to. I'm going to have one more section, but I have to just say how pleased I am because you've had such a long day, and you're still really looking at me. So the question is, how do we enrich our preaching imagination? And I gave you one exercise already about figuring out what do all these abstract theological concepts. They are so important, but people don't always know what they mean. When I get talking about grace with my students, and I'll say, well, what does it mean? And all of a sudden they realize, I said, aren't you going to like it when you go before the board and they ask you what grace is? It's like, oh, well, so I would like to suggest that a way to help you with your preaching imagination. So when I was telling some of the people, when I was in college, I was trained as an art teacher. But unfortunately, I came out of school at the Nixon recession, and nobody was getting jobs. And so I never was an art teacher, but I love teaching. But one of the things I loved about teaching art was that you're teaching people to look. You're teaching people to really look. And I think that one of the problems with preachers is we don't look. We don't really look, and we really don't listen. I told you my students love the listening exercise. There's a difference between hearing and listening. When my children were still at home, but we'd be all having breakfast, if you put a newspaper and a cup of coffee in my hand, I am gone. And they would know that they would have to say, Mom, 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 to get my attention. So obviously the sound waves were hitting my eardrum. I was hearing, but I wasn't listening. So I taught my students, we talked about the difference between hearing and listening. And so I think there's the same difference between seeing and observing. And one of the ways so art teacher, is anybody here an art teacher? This was in the early 70s. So for an art teacher, you were certified K through 12. So I did one student teaching section in an elementary school and one in a high school. I'll bet you knew which one I liked best. I love the kids. But if you take a whole group of little kids out with their pad and go outside, we're going to go outside and draw. All right. Draw that tree over there. Too bad. Oh, I do have a blackboard. Okay. So, I hope this is okay. So, if we're sitting outside and they have pad of paper and a pen, and there's a tree right in front of them, what is it going to look like? Right? Is that what the tree really looks like? No. So how do we enrich our preaching imagination? By really looking, by really listening, by really observing, by being aware how we put on what we think we see instead of what we really, that's why we have to really, my students have to do very long exegesis for their sermons, because you have to dive down into the scriptures. Don't preach a sermon and open up your Bible and say, oh, the prodigal son. I know that one. You don't know that one. You don't know that one. You know it the way you knew it the last time. Right? What's changed? You've changed. Your congregation has changed. Donald Trump is president. The context has changed, and you never know. But, so one of the ways we expand our preaching imagination is by really diving down into the scriptures. But I want to give you another assignment in the last 7 minutes that we have. So when you don't have children as your students and you have high school or college-age students in an art class, always one of the assignments they have is a sketchbook. Anybody take an art class in college? Did you have to have a sketchbook? Of course you had to have a sketchbook. It's training you to look, to really observe and draw not what you think you see, but what you really see. And I think that, I have had my students do this assignment, to have a preaching sketchbook. A preaching sketchbook. And you might actually be really drawing. You might be taking pictures with your phone. You might be writing down a conversation that you hear. But I would argue we are surrounded by burning bushes all the time, and we do not turn aside to investigate. God is filling our world. There are God moments, burning bushes all around. And I think how do we enrich our preaching imagination is by looking, by observing, by listening, by trying to see where God is working. And the way you do that is through the lens of the scripture that you're working on. That's why you don't start on Friday. You don't start on Saturday night. You start at least on Monday, but even that's gone. You can't do that anymore. You got to have sermons working week for weeks and weeks and weeks, because they become the lens. And you're going to listen to a conversation, or you're going to see something funny, or something will catch your eye, and you will turn aside and say, what's going on here? Why did that happen? Why did that catch my eye? And just as the reason that you do it in an art class is because it's training you to really observe, but also then work on that eye-hand control. Well, I think that that's what's helping us as preachers, is to be seeing the world. As you said, you want to see that $100 bill. You want to hear that widow's mite dropping in the treasury. We are sensual people with many senses, and the more you work on those senses, the more your ability to use images and write and talk will come up. And it's something to do every day. Every day. We have 4 minutes left. Let me see where I am. I could go on for about 4 hours, but I bet you don't want to. But I want to see if you have any questions or things you want to add, or Mark, you don't get to do that. You're
from one practitioner to another, and amongst other practitioners, how do you refresh yourself as one who teaches preaching? So that is a challenging endeavor to fill oneself up to teach preachers to preach. How do you cultivate your own preaching life and preaching imagination?
One of the ways is by preaching. I preach quite a bit. I've just been working on one. I'm going to be preaching at the Presbyterian. I live up in Frederick, Maryland, so it's about 50 miles north. And the Presbyterian church is sort of like right behind my house, so I'm going to be preaching there. So I'm preaching on walking in newness of life. And what does newness of life, what does that look like? But I'm using as my image, I'm going to be teaching in Cambridge, England this summer. So my husband and I are going to go to the Cotswolds, and we want to do some walking. Well, I have a bad knee. And so my husband said, I think we should get some of those poles. Well, walking in newness of life is really hard, and we don't know how to do it. And walking with those poles is really hard. We don't know. We bought them, and then we went out one morning really early, like so nobody else would see us. And we live downtown, so it's our it's the historic area. Our house was built in 1860, and we walked out. So then we're there, and we both looked at each other. It's like, well, do you do it this way? Do you do it this way? And we got home and we figured out we need some mentoring, so we put on Google. But so one of the ways I do is that. One of the ways I do it is this. You get me thinking, like, well, what is media? Writing books, or Bob Reed, who I've written with for 20 years. Bob is just hysterical. He's kind of getting ready to retire, but he's still teaching. And if he'll say, well, let me think about that for a minute, and the next morning I'll have 2 full single space pages, So for example, we're thinking about redoing our rhetoric book. I'm working on a book for homileticians, so a more academic look at rhetoric. But don't let anybody say you don't use rhetoric. Everyone uses rhetoric. Everyone uses rhetoric from the time they're 3, or maybe earlier. When you're shaping a message for a particular person, you're using rhetoric. But Bob likes boxes and things, and he was talking about transformational preaching or formational preaching, and I kept saying, Bob, what are you talking about? And he said, well, so I looked it up. He said, well, they use it in business. I thought, okay, so I'm looking at, so transformational preaching would be preachers who think that something will happen because of your sermon. He said, but you're a formational preacher. You want to engage people in a conversation, to be thinking about being formed. So I thought, okay. Yeah. So I emailed him this morning. I said, Bob, I've been thinking about that. I said, he's a Baptist. So, right? So at the end of the sermon, something's going to happen. I said, okay. But I said, my sermon is part of the entire worship service where we come together to hear the word, and we gather the prayers, and we gather, the Eucharist is celebrated. And I said, that whole service, my sermon is part of a whole transformational moment. And I said, that's why at the end we say, send us out now to do the work you have given us to do. I said, that is expecting that transformation has occurred. So I said, I don't think, but I think preaching, keeping on learning, reading. Ron and don't tell them. Don't tell them. This is a secret. Because Ron Allen teaches at the seminary in Indianapolis, and he's retiring. This is bad. All my best friends are retiring. And but they're doing a festschrift for Ron. So this is a secret. So one of the things I had to write was, he does not want us to call preaching proclamation. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, proclamation means it's all set and it's certain. And as I said, he wants this openness, that we're entering in a conversation, but proclamation is sort of like, I'm proclaiming the gospel. I said, so I had to write, am I going to be against that or for that? And I said, well, I am an Anglican. I said, it is both and. But so I had to think about, why would you not think of it as proclamation? And so I said, but it is proclamation because it is just not me. When I am preaching, I am in the Spirit. So I will end with a story, which is what I told in the book, or in this little article, of why. So the first major sermon that I preached was I was doing field work at St. John's, Georgetown. So I'm preaching to secretaries of state and, all of these people. And it was in Lent, and it was the Tower of Siloam, the text with the Tower of Siloam. And I'd worked really hard on the sermon, and I was talking about how death is ever before us. And I told a story when my husband was in medical school. We were in Iowa City, and we were crossing a bridge in the middle of the campus and watched 2 or 3 young people drown right in front of us. Now, just as an aside, at the end of that service, people were leaving, and a person came up and said, "I'm a visitor. I was there that day." Now, I use that to say to my students, don't ever assume that you can tell a story that somebody won't know. But I'd worked really hard, and when that sermon was done, I stood there and I thought, what happened? I was like, did I preach that? The church was silent. And the rector stood up. He was silent. And he said, "How shall they hear unless someone preaches?" And I thought, I did that? But I knew in that moment that it wasn't just me, but I was proclaiming, not because I had figured it all out. I'm a seminarian. But the Holy Spirit uses us. So I said, yes, it is proclamation. So I want to thank you for taking all this time and energy and work to grow in your proclamation and bring this unbelievably good news that we have to people, because they long to hear it. They long to hear it, and they want to hear it. Remember, 83% and 75%.